Hello everyone, and welcome back. Well, after my Christmas Carol reading project back in December, I decided to give this another go. This time, however, I will be reading a very famous piece of Gothic French literature. You may know this story from the Disney film, but its source material is vastly different. It is a story of lust and everyone's obsession around one gypsy girl, most notably from the cathedral's deformed bell ringer and his adopted priest father. This book's original title in France was Notre Dame de Paris. The rest of the world knows this story as The Hunchback of Notre Dame by Victor Hugo. Preface. A few years ago, while visiting, or rather rummaging about Notre Dame, the author of this book found, in an obscure nook of one of the towers, the following word, engraved by hand upon the wall: Anarch. These Greek capitals, black with age, and quite deeply graven in stone, with I know not what signs peculiar to Gothic calligraphy imprinted upon their forms and upon their attitudes, as though with the purpose of revealing that it had been a hand of the Middle Ages which had inscribed them there. And especially the fatal and melancholy meaning contained in them struck the author deeply. He questioned himself. He sought to divine who could have been that soul in torment which had not been willing to quit this world without leaving the stigma of crime or unhappiness upon the brow of the ancient church. Afterwards the walls were whitewashed, or scraped down, I know not which, and the inscription disappeared. For it is thus that people have been in the habit of proceeding with the marvelous churches of the Middle Ages for the last 200 years. Mutilations come to them from every quarter, from within as well as without. The priest whitewashes them, the archdeacon scrapes them down, then the populace arrives and demolishes them. Thus, with the exception of the fragile memory which the author of this book here consecrates to it, there remains today nothing whatever of the mysterious word engraved within the gloomy tower of Notre Dame, nothing of the destiny which it so sadly summed up. The man who wrote that word upon the wall disappeared from the midst of the generations many centuries ago. The word, in its turn, has been effaced from the wall of the church. The church will, perhaps, itself soon disappear from the face of the earth. It is upon this word that the book is founded. March 1831. Book 1. Chapter 1. The Great Hall of the Palace of Justice. On January 6, 1482, the people of Paris were awakened by the tumultuous clanging of all the bells in the city. Yet history has kept no memory of this date, for there was nothing notable about the event which set in motion the bells and the citizens of Paris that morning. It was not an attack by the Picards or the Burgundians, a procession carrying the relics of some saint, an entry of our most dreaded lord, Monsieur the King, nor even a good hanging of thieves. Nor was it the arrival of some foreign ambassador and his train all decked out in lace and feathers, a common sight in the 15th century. It had been scarcely 2 days since the last cavalcade of this kind had paraded through the streets. The delegation of Flemish ambassadors sent to conclude the marriage between the Dauphin and Marguerite of Flanders. To his great annoyance, Cardinal de Bourbon, in order to please the king, had been obliged to give a gracious reception to that uncouth band of Flemish burgomasters, and entertain them in his mansion. The cause of all the commotion on the 6th of January was the double holiday of the Epiphany and the Festival of Fools, united since the time immemorial. This year, the celebration was to include a bonfire at the Place de Grève, a maypole dance at the Chapelle de Braque, and the performance of a play in the Palace of Justice. all of which had been announced by public proclamation the day before. All shops were to remain closed for the holiday. Early in the morning, the crowd began streaming toward the three designated places. It is a great tribute to the common sense of the people of Paris that the majority of the crowd went to either the bonfire, which was quite seasonable, or the play, which is to be performed in the shelter of the great hall of the palace, leaving the poor maypole to shiver beneath the January sky in the cemetery of the Chapelle de Braque. The avenues leading to the Palace of Justice were particularly crowded, because it is known that the Flemish ambassadors who had arrived 2 days before were planning to attend the play and the election of the Pope of Fools, which was also to be held in the palace. It was not easy to get into the Great Hall that day, even though it was reputed at the time to be the largest single room in the world. To the spectators looking out of their windows, the square in front of the palace, packed solid with people, presented the appearance of a sea with 5 or 6 streets flowing into it, constantly disgorging a stream of heads. The waves of this sea broke against the corners of the houses, jutting out like promontories into the irregular basin of the square. Shouts, laughter, and shuffling of thousands of feet blended in to produce a mighty uproar. At the doors and windows on the rooftops swarmed a myriad of sober, honest faces looking at the palace and the crowd with placid contentment. Many Parisians still find deep satisfaction in watching people who are watching something. Even a wall behind which something is happening is an object of great curiosity to them. Let us now imagine that immense oblong hall inside the palace, illuminated by the pale light of a January day and invaded by a motley and noisy crowd pouring in along the walls and swirling around the 7 great pillars. In the middle of the hall, high up against one wall, an enclosed gallery had been erected for the Flemish ambassadors and the other important personages who had been invited to see the play. A private entrance opened into it through one of the windows. At one end of the hall was the famous marble table, so long, wide, and thick that such a slab of marble has never been seen before on earth, as an old document puts it. The play was to be performed on this table, according to custom. It had been set up for that purpose early in the morning. A high wooden platform had been placed on it, the top of which was to serve as the stage. Tapestries hung around the sides formed a sort of dressing room for the actors underneath. A ladder undisguisedly propped up against the outside of the platform connected the dressing room and the stage and served for entrances and exits alike. Every actor, no matter how unexpected his appearance in the play, and every stage effect had to come laboriously up that ladder in full view of the audience. 4 sergeants of the bailiff of the palace, whose duty was to keep order among the people at festivals as well as executions, stood at each corner of the huge marble table. The play was not scheduled to begin until the great clock of the palace struck noon, quite late for a theatrical performance, but it had been necessary to arrange the hour to suit the convenience of the ambassadors. Many of the people had been shivering before the steps of the palace since dawn, and some declared they had spent the whole night huddled in the great doorway in order to make sure of being among the first to enter. The crowd was growing denser at every moment, and like a river overflowing its banks, it soon began to rise up the walls and spill over into the cornices, architraves, window ledges, and all other projecting features of the architecture. Discomfort, patience, boredom, the freedom of a day of license. The quarrels constantly breaking out over a sharp elbow or a hobnailed shoe. The fatigue of a long wait. All this gave a tone of bitterness to the clamor of people as they stood squeezed together, jostled, trampled on, and almost smothered. The air was full of complaints and insults against the Flemings, Cardinal de Bourbon, the bailiff of the palace, the sergeants, the cold, the heat, the bad weather, the Bishop of Paris, the Pope of Fools, the pillars, the statues, this closed door, that open window, all to the great amusement of a band of students and lackeys who, scattered throughout the crowd, mixed their jibes and sarcasm with all the dissatisfaction, and thus goaded the general bad humor into becoming even worse. Some of these merry demons had knocked the glass out of one of the windows, and were boldly sitting in it. From there they were able to direct their bantering remarks both inside and outside, toward the crowd in the hall and the crowd in the square. From their mimicking gestures, their loud laughter and ribald jokes they exchanged with their comrades from one end of the hall to the other, it was easy to see that they did not share the boredom and fatigue of the rest of the spectators, and that they were able to extract enough entertainment from the scenes spread out before their eyes to avoid being impatient for the scheduled performance to begin. "My God! There's Johann Frollo!" shouted one of them to a small blond young man with a handsome, mischievous face who was clinging to the carved foliage at the top of one of the pillars. "How long have you been here?" "More than 4 hours, by the devil's mercy," replied Johann, "and I hope the time will be taken off my term in purgatory." Just then the clock struck noon. "Ah!" said the whole crowd with satisfaction. The students became silent, and there ensued a noisy shuffling of feet, a general craning of necks, and a mighty explosion of coughing as each person stood up and placed himself in the best position to see the stage. Then there was silence. All heads were thrust forward, all mouths were open, and all eyes were turned toward the great marble table. But nothing appeared on it. The 4 sergeants were still there, as stiff and motionless as 4 painted statues. The crowd looked up at the gallery reserved for the Flemish ambassadors. It was empty, and the door leading to it remained shut. They had been waiting since morning for 3 things: noon, the Flemish ambassadors, and the play. Noon was the only one to arrive in time. This was too much. They waited for 1, 2, 3, 5 minutes. A quarter of an hour, nothing happened. The gallery and the stage were still deserted. Impatience began to turn into anger. An irritated murmur sprang up from one end of the hall to the other. "The play! The play! The play!" A storm, which was yet only rumbling in the distance, began to gather over the crowd. It was Johann Frollo who made it first. "Let's have the play, and to hell with the Flemings!" He yelled at the top of his lungs, twisting around his pillar like a serpent. The crowd applauded. "The play!" they repeated. "And to hell with the Flanders!" "If they won't show us the play," went on a student, "I think we ought to hang the bailiff of the palace for entertainment." "That's right," shouted the people. "And let's start by hanging the sergeants!" Loud cheers broke out. The poor sergeants turned pale and looked at each other anxiously. They saw the frail wooden balustrade which separated them from the crowd begin to give way as soon as people pressed forward in a body. It was a critical moment. At that instant, the tapestries forming the dressing room, as we have described above, parted to make way for a man who climbed up on the stage. As if by magic, the sight of him suddenly changed the crowd's anger into curiosity. "Silence! Silence!" Quaking with fear, the man walked unsteadily to the front of the stage with profuse bows which almost became genuflections as he came closer. Meanwhile, calm had been pretty much restored. There remained only the slight murmur which always rises above the silence of a crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we have the honor to perform before His Eminence the Cardinal a very fine morality play entitled The Wise Decision of Our Lady the Virgin. I shall play the part of Jupiter. His Eminence is at this moment accompanying the honorable ambassadors of the Duke of Austria, who are listening to a speech by the rector of the university. As soon as His Eminence arrives, we shall begin." It is certain that nothing less than the intervention of Jupiter could have saved the four unfortunate sergeants. His costume was superb, which contributed considerably toward calming the crowd by attracting their attention. He was wearing a brigandine covered with black velvet, Greek sandals, and a helmet adorned with imitation silver buttons. In his hand he held a roll of gilded cardboard covered with strips of tinsel, which the experienced eyes of the audience easily recognized as a thunderbolt.